Welcome to This Week in Air Safety with your host, Todd Curtis from airsafe.com. As many of you know, I have a audio podcast that's been going on for quite some time, but this is my Ustream channel. We're going to try this out and see if it works. So, today is October 23rd, 2014, and as many of you know, there's been quite a bit of consternation around the world and in the U.S. government about Ebola and what to do with it. Bottom line, there is some threat to Ebola. There have been a handful of cases in the United States, and for various reasons, some of them perhaps politically motivated, some sectors of society are saying there should be some sort of ban on travel from the most affected countries. In that case, the most affected countries are going to be Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, all in West Africa. Now, among other things, there's been a call for a stop of all direct flights from the U.S. To the U.S. from these three countries. Point of fact, no U.S. airline, no U.S. registered airline rather, is making any effort right now to have direct flights to and from those three countries. In fact, if you want to travel there to or from the United States, you'll have to use a non-U.S. airline at some point. And relatively few airlines offer direct service that are outside the United States. And that said, one of the things that has been instituted in the last week or so is a requirement that all travelers from those three countries who are coming to the United States go through one of 5 designated airports. New York, JFK, Newark Airport in the New York area, Washington Dulles, Chicago, and Atlanta. Now, prior to this being put into effect, the U.S. government, by their own records, stated that roughly 95% of all the travelers from those three countries were already going through those airports. Shortly after they instituted the new screening process earlier this month, they put another requirement on it a couple days ago, saying basically as of this coming Monday, which I believe is the 27th of October 2014, all travelers will have to go through those 5 airports. They won't have any choice. Now, I'll get to that later, but let's just say that one of the issues that came up is some sort of travel ban to keep Ebola from coming to the United States. My point of view, looking at this from a risk management perspective, is that such travel bans, if they're effective, will keep certain kinds of risks from the United States, specifically risk of anyone flying from those three countries who happen to be infected from Ebola from getting into the United States. The problem is, first, it's very easy to circumvent the current screening requirements. For example, if your flight originates in those three countries and you decide to spend some time in Europe or Asia or elsewhere for a few days and then fly onwards to the United States, as far as your trip itinerary looks, it looks as though you didn't originate in those three countries. You originated someplace else. And unless the authorities in the United States are questioning every traveler coming in from overseas, they will have no way of knowing where those people were prior to that. Now, realistically, Customs and Border Protection in the United States does on occasion ask travelers, where have you been beforehand, etc. But it's not a systematic every traveler sort of thing. And also, if you are a U.S. citizen, a U.S. Resident, and you have a permanent resident, if you have a U.S. passport, you can leave the country without telling the government anything, except for a handful of countries like North Korea and Cuba. So, if you're a U.S. citizen and you want to fly to virtually any country on Earth, including those 3 in West Africa, you don't have to give prior approval to the U.S. government. So they may not know directly that you're there in the first place. Now, let's get back to the risk management aspect of this. As is the case in aviation safety, risks are inherent with the practice of flying. There are ways that you can manage the risk, and basically the goal of risk management, one of 3 goals, is to either A, eliminate it from happening, B, make it much less likely it'll happen, and C, if it happens, arrange things so that the effects aren't as bad as if you did nothing. Now, more specifically, risk can be defined in an objective way. Something that you want to avoid and the probability of that something happening. Those two go together. Unlike safety, which is more of a subjective quality, risk can be an objective quality. Whether or not it's measured mathematically or probabilistically modeled, etc., you can at least set it up so that if you have a definition for the risk and you give several people that definition and you ask them to categorize the situation and measure the risk, they should come out with something pretty much the same. Whereas if you ask the person, is this safe? opinions will be all over the map. I make a long story short, safety is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. Take, for example, a few days ago, there was a nurse who had been treating a patient for Ebola in Dallas, who herself came down with the disease. Now, she had flown from Dallas to Cleveland for personal reasons, and on the way back, she was feeling ill. Now, the reports are somewhat confusing at this point, but it seems that the sequence of events was as follows. She took off from Dallas. She may or may not have been feeling ill. She was in Cleveland. She felt ill, and she apparently asked not one but two organizations for help. One, she contacted some entity in Texas to see if there would be some private flight that could take her back. That request was refused. And by the way, this is the fairly breaking news. I just heard about this yesterday. I haven't seen any follow-up on this. But the second part, that's very solid. She contacted the CDC. CDC at the time had a process where if you were in her position, you would either be approved or not approved to fly on, let's say, an air carrier. She had a fever. The fever was below the threshold they had at the time. The CDC gave her the okay to fly back. Now, as many of you know, once she did fly back, there was a lot of concern that she might have infected other people on the airplane. The airplane was taken out of service, cleaned multiple times. The seat covers and such were changed in the area where she was. And the airline and the CDC collectively were trying to contact 800 different passengers. The passengers who were on the two flights she was on, plus 5 flights full of passengers flown by the plane that the nurse was on when she flew back to Dallas. Apparently there were 5 flights of that airplane the following day before it was taken out of service. So what was a risk measure or a risk requirement for the CDC was seen before this event as being safe. That is, the risk was acceptable. Once the event happened, that risk was no longer acceptable. The CDC did change their policies. So it's no longer possible for a person in that position, a medical professional who's ill, to fly on an airline. Now, let's move forward to the travel ban for West Africa. Looking at this from the risk management perspective, if the ban is in place to keep people from flying from those 3 countries, it won't necessarily prevent the real risk, that is, the risk of the virus coming into the United States. Because, point of fact, someone can contract the virus in one country and go to another country, maybe several other countries, before coming to the United States. The virus has an incubation period that can be anywhere from a couple days to up to about 3 weeks. So if you're just banning people who are from those 3 countries, let's put it this way. If you were a traveler in those 3 countries and you needed to get to the United States, you knew that there was a travel ban in effect for anyone who originated their trip in those 3 countries. Would you do something to originate your trip from another country? For example, travel to another country in Africa or Asia or Europe? Or would you do other things to get to the United States if you felt that you were not at risk, if you felt that you were not infected, if you felt healthy, and you just wanted to get back to the United States? What would you do? Would you run the risk of losing all the money for your ticket, of interrupting whatever schedule you had back in the United States? Or would you, in a sense, roll the dice and try and make it back? So, if you had a ban, it may not be effective. But here's something even more important. If you had a ban, and you were focusing on people flying from outside the United States, and your purpose was to keep the virus off of aircraft, that sort of idea of banning people from overseas doesn't really address the big problem. What if you're already in the United States? What if you're taking a domestic flight, much like that nurse did in Texas, going to Cleveland? What's in place to prevent that sort of thing from happening? The bottom line, nothing. You could have been in those countries in the last 3 weeks. You could be in the United States through any number of means, flying directly, flying to Canada or Mexico and coming into the land border, etc. Now you're in the United States. You can freely fly on airlines, and the TSA is not screening anyone for this sort of thing. And to realistically screen the entire air transportation system to keep at-risk individuals off the system, you would have to institute something not just for incoming people into the United States, but for virtually every flyer in the nation. And given that the United States accounts for roughly 50% of all airline traffic, one can imagine how big of a task that would be. So, in my opinion, I think the government realizes this, they're not stupid, that the task to really have an effective program in place to keep not just overseas travelers, but all travelers off of aircraft is so daunting. And the speed at which the epidemic is changing, morphing, etc., is so great that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for the bureaucratic process of U.S. aviation system. I don't mean that in a negative way, but it just takes time to implement new processes, new policies, training, etc. By the time you have an effective screening process or travel ban, etc., in place, the nature of the threat will have changed. And the speed of that change, I believe, in my opinion, is faster than the speed at which the organizations who are responsible for safety and security can change. So, don't want to bore you too much. I'd like to make this a more regular habit, that is live broadcasts here from the current airsafe.com headquarters. So, for now at least, I'd like to sign off. This is October 23rd, 2014. And this is the airsafe.com, This Week in Airline Safety with airsafe.com. See you soon. Bye-bye.